Asterisk, the mind you ignore will control your entire life. There is a place inside you that no one else can see. It speaks without sound. It moves without motion. It shapes your decisions before you are even aware you are making them. And if you do not learn to face it, to understand it, to master it, it will quietly take control of everything you become. Not through force, but through repetition, through habit, through silence. You were never truly in control in the way you believe you are. Most people live their entire lives thinking they are choosing freely, thinking their decisions are born from logic, awareness, and intention. But the truth is far more uncomfortable. You are not only the thinker, you are also the thought being thought. You are not only the observer, you are also the program being observed. And somewhere beneath your awareness, a hidden architecture is shaping your reactions, your fears, your desires, and your limitations. This is what modern psychology began to uncover, and what Carl Jung spent his life trying to reveal in deeper form. The unseen mind, the unconscious force that directs the conscious self like a shadow behind the curtain. And the terrifying truth is this: the parts of you that you ignore do not disappear. They grow stronger in the dark. You call it procrastination, you call it anxiety, you call it laziness, you call it lack of discipline. But beneath all those labels, there is something simpler, something more profound, unintegrated parts of the self-demanding attention. And if you refuse to face them, they will not remain silent. They will shape your habits. They will distort your perception. They will limit your potential without ever asking for permission. Think about this carefully. Every time you say, "I know what I should do, but I can't do it," you are not dealing with a lack of knowledge. You are dealing with a divided mind, a conflict between what you consciously desire and what your unconscious has already accepted as identity. This is where most people live their entire lives, trapped between intention and resistance, between vision and fear, between potential and comfort. And the longer this conflict remains unresolved, the more control the unconscious takes. It does not announce itself. It does not argue. It simply redirects your life quietly. You want discipline, but you wake up late. You want success, but you avoid discomfort. You want clarity, but you feed your mind chaos. And slowly, over time, your actions begin to betray your intentions, not because you are weak, but because you are divided. There is a version of you that dreams, and there is a deeper version of you that decides what is allowed. Most people never question that deeper version. They never ask, who inside me is making these decisions? Why do I resist what I say I want? Why does comfort feel safer than growth, even when I know it is destroying me? These are not simple questions. They are psychological turning points. Because the moment you begin to question your internal structure, you stop living as a passive participant in your own life, and you begin the slow process of becoming conscious. Carl Jung described this process not as improvement, but as integration. The act of bringing what is hidden into awareness. The act of turning the unconscious into something you can observe instead of something that controls you. Because what you do not see controls what you do, and what controls you without awareness becomes your identity. Look at history, not the surface level stories of success, but the psychological reality behind them. Thomas Edison did not become extraordinary because he avoided failure. He became extraordinary because he redefined failure as feedback, not identity collapse. Henry Ford did not reshape industry because he was fearless. He succeeded because he refused to let early failures define his internal narrative. Walt Disney was rejected repeatedly, not because he lacked imagination, but because he had to confront internal and external forces telling him his vision was unrealistic. And yet he continued, not because life became easier, but because his internal world became clearer than external resistance. That is the real difference. Not talent, not luck, but internal alignment. When a mind is unified, obstacles become temporary. When a mind is divided, even small tasks feel impossible. And so the question is never, How do I become more successful? The real question is, what parts of me are currently working against me? Because there is always resistance. But resistance is not always external. Sometimes it is your own identity rejecting change. You want a new life, but you are still psychologically attached to the old one. You want discipline, but your identity is built around comfort. You want growth, but your subconscious is still loyal to safety. And so you experience friction. Not because the goal is impossible, but because the mind is inconsistent. This is where most transformation fails, not in action, but in identity conflict. You try to change behavior without changing internal agreement. You try to build discipline without rebuilding self-image. You try to move forward while part of you is still emotionally anchored to who you used to be. And that is why progress feels exhausting. Because you are not just moving forward, you are dragging resistance behind you. Real change begins when resistance is no longer hidden. When you stop pretending your mind is unified. When you stop assuming your thoughts are always truthful. When you begin to observe yourself as if you are both the thinker and the thing being thought. Because in that space, there is awareness. And awareness is the first form of power. Not control, not domination, but clarity. And clarity is what dissolves unconscious control. Most people never reach this stage because they are addicted to distraction. Distraction is not entertainment. It is avoidance. It is the mind strategy for not facing itself. Every scroll, every delay, every unnecessary stimulation, it is not random. It is protective behavior. The unconscious mind avoids confrontation with anything that threatens its current structure, and growth is always a threat to structure. That is why discipline feels painful at first, because discipline is not just action. It is identity reconstruction. It is the conscious mind challenging the unconscious agreement you have lived by for years. And every time you choose discipline over comfort, you are not just completing a task. You are rewriting the internal contract of who you are, slowly, repeatedly, quietly, until one day what once felt impossible becomes natural. Not because the task changed, but because you changed. And this is the hidden truth most people never understand. You do not rise to your goals. You fall or rise to your internal identity. And the mind you ignore becomes the identity you live by. So the question is no longer whether you are capable. The question is whether you are willing to see what has been controlling you in silence. Because the moment you see it clearly, it begins to lose power. And what loses power in awareness can no longer define your future in the dark. You begin to notice something subtle when awareness deepens. It is not that your life suddenly changes. It is that you begin to see what was always shaping it. The same thoughts that repeat themselves when you are alone. The same excuses that arrive dressed as logic. The same emotional patterns that decide your direction before you even speak. And once you see them, truly see them, something irreversible happens inside the mind. You can no longer pretend ignorance. And ignorance was always the foundation of unconscious control. Carl Jung spoke of this in a way most people misunderstand. He was not talking about knowledge in the academic sense. He was pointing towards something far more intimate, the confrontation with oneself, the willingness to look inward without distortion. Because the human mind has an extraordinary ability to avoid itself. It can analyze the world, it can judge others, it can plan futures, but when turned inward, it becomes uncomfortable, restless, defensive, and that resistance is not random, it is protective, because inside you exists everything you have not yet accepted. Every fear you buried instead of facing, every desire you suppressed instead of understanding, every failure you reinterpreted instead of learning from, every emotion you labeled as not me instead of integrating, and all of it still exists, not as memory, but as influence. You may think the past is behind you, but psychologically the past does not move. It accumulates, And if it is not integrated, it becomes behavior. This is why people repeat the same life in different environments, different cities, different relationships, different opportunities, same outcomes, because they changed everything external, except the internal pattern producing the result. And the mind, left unexamined, is loyal to repetition. It prefers the familiar even when the familiar is destructive. This is why people stay in cycles they claim to hate. This is why they return to habits they swear they will leave. This is why potential remains theory instead of reality, because unconscious loyalty is stronger than conscious intention. Unless awareness intervenes, and awareness does not shout, it does not force, it simply reveals. It shows you the pattern without judgment. And in that moment of recognition, something begins to shift. Because for the first time, you are not inside the pattern. You are observing it, and what you observe, you begin to separate from. This is where transformation begins, not in action but in perception. Most people attempt to change their lives by attacking behavior, but behavior is only the final expression of something deeper. Behind every habit is a belief. Behind every belief is an identity. And behind every identity is an unconscious agreement about what is possible for you. If that agreement is limited, your life will reflect limitation no matter how hard you try. This is why effort alone is not enough. Effort applied to the wrong internal structure only strengthens the structure. You can discipline a belief system that still belongs to fear. You can organize habits that still belong to self-doubt. You can build routines inside a mind that still identifies with limitation. And yet nothing fundamentally changes, because the root remains untouched. This is where most people misunderstand themselves. They think they are struggling with discipline. But discipline is not the problem. They think they lack motivation. But motivation is not the issue. They think they need better systems. But systems cannot override identity. The real struggle is internal fragmentation. A divided self trying to move in a unified direction. One part of you wants expansion. Another part wants safety. One part seeks growth. Another part protects the familiar. And neither side is wrong. But one side is unconscious. And unconscious forces always win by default. Not because they are stronger, but because they are unseen. A conscious desire cannot compete with an unconscious program it cannot identify, and so life becomes a negotiation between awareness and invisibility, between what you know and what you are still governed by. But there is a moment, subtle, almost imperceptible, when something changes. It happens when you stop reacting to yourself. When instead of saying, "Why am I like this?" you begin asking, "What part of me is operating right now?" That shift is everything, because now you are no longer the identity inside the pattern. You are the observer of the pattern, and observation changes structure, just as light changes what it touches. Think about how humanity has always evolved, not through comfort, but through confrontation with limitation. When Edison worked through thousands of failed attempts, it was not failure that defined him. It was persistence in the presence of uncertainty. When Abraham Lincoln faced repeated political rejection, it was not defeat that shaped him. It was the refusal to let external rejection become internal collapse. When Walt Disney was told his imagination lacked creativity, he did not argue against the statement. He simply continued building a reality that proved it irrelevant. What separated them from others was not external advantage. It was internal orientation. They were not ruled by the immediate feedback of the world. They were guided by something deeper within themselves, a vision not yet visible. And that is where most people lose themselves. They abandon their internal direction too quickly. They surrender to temporary discomfort. They interpret resistance as a stop sign instead of a threshold. But resistance is not a signal to stop. It is a signal that something inside you is being reorganized. Because growth is not comfortable alignment. It is controlled disintegration of the old self. And the mind resists this because it interprets disintegration as danger, even when it is evolution. So you feel stuck, not because you are incapable, but because two versions of you are negotiating existence. The old self that seeks stability, and the emerging self that seeks expansion. And whichever one you feed with attention becomes dominant. If you feed fear, it expands. If you feed clarity, it strengthens. If you feed avoidance, it grows. If you feed action, it dissolves hesitation. Not immediately, but inevitably, because attention is not passive. It is formative. It shapes identity through repetition. And every moment of your life is a vote for the kind of mind you are becoming. But most people vote unconsciously. They vote for distraction. They vote for delay. They vote for comfort disguised as logic. And then they wonder why their life does not change. But change was never absent. It was simply being directed elsewhere. The mind you ignore is not inactive. It is always constructing, always reinforcing, always shaping. And if you are not consciously directing it, it will continue without you. This is why introspection is not optional for growth. It is foundational. Because without it, you are not the author of your life. You are the result of it. But when you begin to observe your inner world with honesty, without distortion, without avoidance, you begin to reclaim something essential: choice. Real choice. Not reaction disguised as decision. Not habit disguised as preference, but conscious selection of direction. And this is where power begins to emerge. Not external power, internal sovereignty. The ability to witness your thoughts without being governed by them. The ability to feel emotion without surrendering to it. The ability to notice impulse without obeying it. And slowly, over time, something remarkable happens. The unconscious begins to lose authority, not because it disappears, but because it is no longer invisible, and what is seen can no longer secretly rule. And yet, even after awareness begins to grow, there is a phase most people never prepare for, because seeing the unconscious mind is not the end of the struggle. It is the beginning of responsibility. When you first observe your inner patterns clearly, something uncomfortable happens. You can no longer blame confusion. You can no longer hide behind ignorance. You can no longer say, "I didn't know why I did it," because now you do. And that knowledge changes everything. Carl Jung described this moment in human development as a confrontation with the shadow, not a poetic idea, a psychological reality. The shadow is not evil. It is not darkness in a moral sense. It is everything within you that has been excluded from conscious identity. The traits you denied, the emotions you suppressed, the desires you judged, the fears you avoided. And because they were not integrated, they did not disappear. They became autonomous. They began influencing your decisions indirectly. You may think you are acting rationally, but often you are acting in response to unacknowledged internal forces, a reaction shaped by old pain, a decision influenced by hidden insecurity, a choice driven by fear you never fully faced. And so, the shadow becomes the unseen author behind many of your behaviors, not because it controls you like an external enemy, but because it operates without recognition, and anything unrecognized gains influence. This is why people repeat emotional patterns even when they intellectually understand them. Understanding is not integration. You can understand your fear and still be ruled by it. You can understand your procrastination and still obey it. You can understand your self-sabotage and still participate in it. Because awareness without integration is incomplete. It is like seeing a locked door without holding the key. But the key is not complicated. It is acceptance, not approval, not justification, but acknowledgement. The willingness to say, "This exists within me," without distortion, without rejection, without denial. And this is where most people hesitate, because acceptance feels like surrender. But it is actually the opposite. Denial gives control to what you refuse to see. Acceptance takes control away from what hides in the dark. Because once something is acknowledged, it enters consciousness. And once it enters consciousness, it becomes available for transformation. But transformation does not happen instantly. It begins with tension, a psychological discomfort between who you were and who you are becoming. You begin to notice contradictions inside yourself. You want discipline, but feel resistance. You want growth, but feel fear. You want change, but feel attachment to the familiar. And instead of one unified identity, you experience internal division. But this division is not failure. It is exposure. It is the mind revealing its structure. And structure must be seen before it can be rebuilt. Think of every great transformation in history. It began with disruption of identity, not comfort, not stability, but friction between old understanding and new awareness. Thomas Edison did not invent the light bulb in certainty. He built it through repeated confrontation with uncertainty. Henry Ford did not revolutionize industry by maintaining tradition. He challenged the very structure of production itself. Walt Disney did not build an empire by conforming to existing imagination. He expanded imagination beyond accepted limits. And in every case, there was resistance, internal and external, because anything new threatens the stability of what already exists. And the mind is deeply invested in stability, even when stability becomes limitation. This is why change feels psychologically threatening. Not because change is dangerous, but because identity resists dissolution. The self you currently believe you are was not built in a moment. It was constructed slowly, through repetition, through environment, through emotional experiences, through interpretation of success and failure, and over time, this constructed self becomes familiar, even comforting, even when it is limiting. And so when growth begins to challenge that structure, the mind reacts. It produces hesitation, it generates doubt, it creates reasons to delay. Not because it is malicious, but because it is protective. The unconscious mind does not evaluate truth. It preserves familiarity, and familiarity often becomes mistaken for safety. But familiarity is not safety, it is repetition, and repetition does not guarantee growth. It only guarantees continuity. So when you attempt to change, you are not simply adding new habits. You are threatening an internal system that has been stable for years, and systems resist disruption. This is why discipline feels heavy at first, because discipline is not just action, it is confrontation with identity resistance. Every time you act against old patterns, you are not just changing behavior, you are challenging the authority of your unconscious programming. And the unconscious does not surrender easily. It reinforces doubt, it amplifies discomfort, it amplifies excuses. It attempts to pull you back into known identity. But if you persist, if you continue acting despite resistance, something begins to shift, not immediately in external results, but internally in structure. Because repetition under awareness creates reconditioning, and reconditioning slowly rewrites identity. This is the real work, not motivation, not inspiration, but sustained awareness combined with action. Action without awareness reinforces old patterns. Awareness without action creates stagnation. But the combination of both creates transformation. And transformation is not dramatic at first. It is subtle. You notice small differences. A moment where you choose discipline instead of delay. A moment where you observe fear instead of obeying it. A moment where you act despite discomfort rather than waiting for certainty. And these moments accumulate, not loudly, but persistently, until one day what once required effort begins to feel natural. Not because the challenge disappeared, but because the identity changed. And identity is what determines ease. You do not struggle with habits you fully identify with. You struggle with habits that contradict your self-image. So the real shift is not behavioral, it is psychological alignment. When your internal identity and your external actions begin to match, resistance decreases. And when resistance decreases, momentum increases. And when momentum increases, life begins to feel different, not easier, but clearer, because clarity replaces confusion, and confusion was always the true source of suffering, not the difficulty of life, but the lack of internal coherence. And so, slowly, the mind you once ignored begins to transform, not because it disappears, but because it becomes conscious. And what becomes conscious can finally be guided instead of obeyed.